than the students in the control group. So although there were differences between the responses, they're confounding. Okay? They're not all in one direction or the other. So to sum up this part, so the perceptions and attitudes, the perceptions were similar, although the students in the flipped class thought that the course was more valuable to their education. And then there were some differences in student attitudes, but I suspect it's because I have such small groups that I'm not being able to tweak that out very well. So since I did this study, I finished the study in a year ago, and I've been analyzing the data since. There's been 3 recent studies that have come out in JChem Ed that I wanted to compare my results to these 3 recent studies. And they're similar in that they're all Gen Chem courses, but in all cases, these we're looking at the second semester of a year-long Gen Chem sequence. So it's a little bit different. And they didn't have the same kind of control in setting up the populations as I did. Okay, so to start with, oops, wrong way. In this course, a faculty person taught the same year-long Gen Chem course for 5 years, 2 years in the traditional method, 3 years in a flipped, and then compared the performance between the students in the flipped classes and the students in the traditional. In this one here, the students were taught the first semester using a traditional format, lecture-based format, and then the students were taught in a flipped method in the second semester. Okay, and they compared the student performance in the second semester to student performance in the first semester. Okay, and this was done over 3 years. And then the last study that just recently came out was where all the students were taught in a traditional fashion in the first semester, and then it was advertised that there was going to be a second semester taught in the flipped section, and so a flipped approach, so students could choose whether they wanted to take a traditional section or a flipped section, and then they compared the performance of the students in the flipped who self-selected to go into the flipped to the students who self-selected to go into the traditional. Okay. So those were the 3 studies that I'm aware of that just came out in terms of the chemistry flipped. So to compare my results, first of all, in all of those 3, they reduced the number of contact hours in the classroom to account for students watching videos outside of class. Okay? I didn't do that. So my students, I met with the experimental students the same number of times as I met with traditional, so that's a big difference. But when we look at their results, they all found a decrease in the DFW percentages when comparing the flipped to the traditional. I didn't see that, but I had small numbers. 2 of the studies reported that the performance in the students in terms of performance on ACS exams was better for those students who had been given the flipped approach versus the students who had the traditional approach. One of the studies, Brian, was similar to mine, that didn't find any significant difference in performance between flipped and traditional, but they did find that the lower quartile of the student population did better in the flipped class than the lower quartile in the traditional class. That's sort of consistent with my results. They were able to use performance in the first semester to decide who was in the lower quartile. Okay, the only thing I could use is high school GPAs, and I did see that more of my students with lower high school GPAs left than students in the control section than the students in my flip section. So that's pretty comparable. Weaver found that when she looked at performance on the ACS exam, if she separated them into algorithmic and conceptual, that her students in the flipped class did better on the conceptual. And I'm still trying to tweak that out, whether or not I see anything. And then in terms of, most of these studies didn't really look at attitude so much, but Weaver did look at what was the most useful activity, and in her studies, she found that the students in the flipped class also always ranked the most useful activity as working with others in class. Okay, so what does that all mean as far as I'm concerned, or as far as what I'm going to do in the future? I'm not convinced, that it's the answer to everything. But I do think it has some real value when you're teaching a diverse group of students who have very different backgrounds. I think that it offers another type of resource, and it for the weaker students, but it opens up this opportunity for doing problems while you have an expert there to work with you. So I think the working together in the classroom and using your time in the classroom to just do problems is really, for many of these students, was all they really needed to do to be successful in this class. So for a Gen Chem class, where students come in with very diverse backgrounds, this might be more efficient. Okay? So some of the students, I think all they did was come to class, do the problems, and they did well. But the problem is that it does take a lot of time to create these videos. And initially, the students were resistant to what we were doing, but by the end of the semester, they seemed much more open to it. So with that, I want to thank you for your attention and open it up to questions.
So you said they were more open to the concept by the end of the semester, but they're actually watching less videos by the end of the semester. What do you mean by they're more open to it?
Well, in the end, when I asked a question in one of my surveys, what they thought of the design of the course, and there's 26 responses, and 16 of them said they really, this is the experimental group, 16 said they really liked the design of the course. So I think they liked the design of the course if they were watching the videos. Those are the weaker students, because they could watch the videos multiple times at their own pace. And I think for the students who weren't watching the videos, they liked just working on the problems during class time and not being lectured to. So I think that they they came to realize as the semester progressed that they could be successful on the exams and quizzes with this format, and so they became more accepting of it. Does that answer your question? Yes.
Do you have, you mentioned that a lot of people weren't watching the videos, but do you have any measure for about how much time they were spending outside of class on chemistry material? Because like when I was a student, I spent enough time to get the homework done, and that was about it. And so I wonder if, being able to do the homework in class, they were spending less time overall. I guess you have the Blackboard data.
Yeah, that's the only data I have. I know that the students in the experimental group spent more time on Blackboard, but I also know that the weaker students accessed the videos more often before class, and they went back and accessed them again after class. So looking at the average, even though the average amount of time spent on Blackboard was greater in my experimental group, I can't figure out you know, was that because I had 4 students that watched the videos a lot, or, you know what I mean? So yeah, that's a piece of information that I don't have. Based on their homework performance, their pre-class homework, and you know, the personality of the class that I was working with in the experimental group, I really don't think they did much. Many of them I don't think did much at all outside of class. Yes.
Question. So did this influence how much they access office hours, or in what context they did, what types of questions they were asking?
You know, I don't know, because you know, it's a small number. I do know I kept track of how many of the students from the control group came to my office hours versus how many students from my experimental group, and it was like 90% of the students who visited me in office hours was from my control group. Okay, much less visited me from my experimental group. But you know, why is that? I'm not sure. It might be that because I was interacting with the students in the experimental group for 2 75-minute sections each week. They could ask their questions right there. I'm not really sure, but definitely less of this. I had many fewer students from the flipped class come to my office hours, and they didn't go to the tutorial center either, because I asked them about attending the tutorial center, and pretty much both sections that was an NA. So even though we provide this service, most of the students don't use it. But I have to, you know how it is, but you have these are small sections, right? So I had the 2 sections had hugely different personalities. The control group was a lot more fun, they were really vocal, they asked lots of questions, whereas my experimental group, very reserved, very quiet, you know, just a different set of students.
Do you think you see that because extroverted students sign up for the experimental group, or does the experimental group
They didn't
make
have
them
a choice.
extroverted?
They didn't have a choice. Remember, I placed them into the 2 sections. But you're right. I could not control for that. I couldn't. When I placed when I created the 2 sections, I couldn't take into account personality type or learning styles or anything like that. I just looked at demographics and high school performance.
It's terribly interesting, and I'm fascinated by this because I'm often at odds with myself to contextualize how a student feels about my course. But first of all, students don't always know what's best for them, axiomatically. But also, not to be overly blunt, but it sounds like you had a group of hardworking students who didn't feel so great about it, and you had a group of not so hardworking students who felt great about the experience. So, I mean, how do you, especially before and after you undertook this experience, how do you contextualize how a student feels about it, right? Because I'm a big believer in, like, I can do this. Like, mindset is everything. Don't defeat yourself before you start. But I also would rather my students be good at chemistry rather than feel good about chemistry. So how do you contextualize this?
Yeah, trying to get at that motivation, or does the approach affect their motivation? Yeah, I mean, I tried to look at this, you know, emotional accessibility. I found that interesting, and that was consistent with the responses that the students, although they were, I think, by nature reserved and quiet, the open-ended responses to the open-ended questions in my surveys from the experimental group were much more favorable in terms of, I mean, there were a couple of students that said, I hate this, I want to have lecture. But most of the students said they really liked it, they liked working with problems,
Kind of related to that, like the beginning of the semester when the students became aware that there was a control versus an experimental group and they didn't get to pick which one they wanted to be in, did any of them try to switch because they really didn't want to do one over the other?
Surprisingly, no. So on the first day of class, I explained to them that the purpose of this experiment was for me to become a better teacher, to learn how, you know, what types of things work best for students, and that's why I was doing this. They did have an option to switch to a different section, and I didn't lose anything. So yeah, I forgot to mention, there was in the 3 recent studies, they did a very good job of, or they tried to control for contact time, and they also tried to control for crosstalk. Okay, and I didn't do that, and I did find that some of my students in my control group were watching the videos, okay, because they could work with other friends, and those students ranked the use of videos very high. But I suspect those were, once again, you know, the students that were struggling a little bit more, and so having that additional resource available was useful to them.
My question was almost the same answer. Did you sell that at all?
Yeah, it was a sales pitch, and it worked. They stayed with me.
So one of the demographics you looked at was high school GPA, and you chose around like a 3.6 or 3.7.
Well, I just wanted to make sure they were comparable.
Okay. Do you think that your results would be changed if you were to lower the average GPA, high school GPA of your classes to around a 3 or so?
You know, based on what other people have found, I think it could make a difference. I think that what others have found is that the more struggling student appreciates the flipped class more because they have additional resources available and they have more individual attention. And so in other studies, they found that the lower quartile ended up doing better in the flipped than in the non-flipped. So that could have been, but I just created 2 classes, and I think the incoming GPA, the average GPA of incoming students at Gonzaga is right around 3.6, 3.7. So it's consistent with others.
So I know you mentioned that the experimental homeworks had lower grades than the control experiments, but yet the class test averages were the same. Do you think that was because the experimental groups were more confident, like going through the problem sets because they had the experience working with you and other people in class, and that helped build their confidence? And do you think that could be where the difference is coming from, because they're a little bit more confident, so that can kind of compensate for not doing their homework?
Yeah, that could be a possibility, but I don't think so, and it's because I had expected that this performance on the post-class assignments, the students in the experimental section would do better. I thought they would, because they had an opportunity to do so many problems in class, I thought they would do better on the post-class than the students in the control group, but they didn't. So if I separate the pre-class and post-class, in both cases, pre-class and post-class, the students in the experimental did do well. And I think it was just because they're poorer students, they're not as interested students, poorer students. Okay, so yes?
So I was thinking about the fact that, you know, you're trying to control for the instructor effect by being the instructor in both courses, but you've been teaching the lecture version for many years, whereas I assume this is your first time teaching this. Second time teaching it. So do you think there's still a learning curve for you in learning how to do it?
Yeah, definitely, because my videos were 23 minutes, on average 23 minutes long, which is too long. You know, I needed to pare them down to less than 15 minutes. So, yeah, I think that there's definitely room for improvement in terms of the flipped delivery.
How do you, going off that, like, the being too long, like, it seemed like that in the experimental, like, the students had less blackboard time. If you factored out the control of the video, they had like, significantly less time looking at the poster or the presentation, all that. How do you factor it seemed like the students just kind of worn out. From my perspective as a student, I would be looking at the scores like, you're expecting to do all this outside of class. That seems like way too much and like not actually getting out of there. You saw it in like them dropping in their video time. It seemed like they just were tired of doing something outside of class. I think a big benefit of like the normal classroom is like you're forced to sit there and go through the entire presentation and have somebody's eye contact looking at you so you're paying attention to that. How do you, I think it's kind of a larger philosophical question about this whole classroom thing.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't really know. I mean, because you'd almost like what's confusing for me is, you know, I put these pre-class homework, but they could use the textbook to to answer the questions just as much as the videos. And I mean, that's all the control group had was the textbook. I will mention that the control group pretty much consistently complained about the pre-class homework, the pre-class graded homework. That was pretty much like 18 out of 22 complained about having pre-class homework that was graded, whereas only like one person mentioned it in the flip class, which I found interesting. But maybe it was because the students in the control group, all they had was the textbook, and the students in the other section had both. But yeah, I think that's why the other three studies, they controlled for contact time by eliminating classroom time. So instead of meeting, twice a week for 75 minutes, they only met once a week for 75 minutes because they expected the students to do more outside of class. So maybe if I had done that, maybe I wouldn't have seen quite as much of a drop off at the end.
Yeah, and there's all students who have like spent their entire lives in one type of classroom, studying in for
Yeah.
If there aren't any more questions, we do have this room till 2 for just like open socialization. Any questions for Joanne? You're welcome. Eat more food and just make sure you signed up or signed in at least. And we can thank Joanne one more time.